I have so enjoyed the preaching, not just this morning, but really the entire meeting. And if I can be honest enough to say, I think all of us would agree we've been in the situation where we've been to many different meetings where there was one sermon, two sermons, maybe three that was spot on, that was helpful, and you sit through two and you get one that's really great. But I can honestly say that every message that I've sat and listened to, I've said, man, that was great. Well, that was good preaching. That helped me. Every message. And I just rejoice in it and thank God for it. And Brother McCauley, thank you for the message this morning. I'm glad God is for us. I'm glad He's on our side. Then Dr. Anderson, what a message. It'll be a long time before I forget that. And I listened to that, and here's what I think. I said, man, our church needs to hear that. Man, they need to come in and preach that to our church. All right? And thank God for His preaching. 1 Kings chapter 8, give you a little simple thought this morning before we go to lunch. 1 Kings chapter 8. Begin reading with me in verse number 1. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon at the feast in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. And they brought up the ark of the Lord in the tabernacle of the congregation, and all the holy vessels that were in the tabernacle. Even these did the priests and the Levites bring up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel that were assembled with him, unto him, were there with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be told nor numbered for multitude. And the priests brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord unto his place, and to the oracle of the house, to the most holy place, even under the wings of the cherubims. Well, the cherubims spread forth their two wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubims covered the ark and the staves thereof above. And they drew out the staves, that the ends of the staves were seen out in the holy place before the oracle. They were not seen without, and there they are unto this day. For many years, Bible students have looked at the reign of Solomon as both a type of Christ and a type of Antichrist. I'll not bother to give you the points for those who see him as a forerunner of Antichrist, because I believe that his reign primarily is a foreshadowing of the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. And I know that Solomon was an imperfect man. I know that he was a sinner. I know that he was a man that had great failures, and so he is a bit of an enigma. But every other man in the Old Testament who was a type of Christ was a sinner as well. For one thing, the reign of Solomon began with judgment. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 1 and chapter 2, Solomon is seen calling some men who seems like have gotten away with crimes, and he is calling them to justice. One man even goes in and clings to the altar of God, but it's too late to escape the judgment of Solomon. And when Jesus comes to begin his reign, it will begin with judgment against transgressors. When Solomon was the king, Gentile kings came to Jerusalem and gave him gifts, and Isaiah pointed to the reign of Christ, and he said that in that day the Gentiles shall come to thy light and see the brightness of thy rising. And he said that all they from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and incense, and they shall show forth the praises of the Lord. In the history of Israel, Solomon was the wisest king. He was the wealthiest king. He was the most peaceful king. I think that it points to the reign of Christ. I suppose the greatest reason that I believe that Solomon is a type of Christ and not Antichrist is because Jesus himself said that it was. The queen of the south shall rise up in judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them, for she came from the utmost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Behold, one greater than Solomon is here. And one of the things that Solomon is most remembered for in his 40-year reign is his building. Without a doubt, he was the greatest builder in all of the Bible. If you back up just 2 chapters before this, in chapter 6, he begins the construction of the temple. The temple would be the house of worship for the nation of Israel. It would replace the tabernacle. The blueprints were actually drawn up by David, his father. And it would take him 7 years to build that temple. It would be the most magnificent house of worship that the world had ever seen. In chapter 7, Solomon then would build his own house, and it would take 13 years to build his own house. Some have looked at that and said that Solomon had his priorities wrong because he spent more time building his house than he did the temple. I don't think that it's fair. I don't know that we can judge that motive. But in chapter number 8, the temple is finally finished, and it is time to dedicate the temple. The temple was finished in the 8th month, but it would actually be the 7th month of the following year before they would have the dedication service 11 months later. And some commentators think that next year was the year of Jubilee. That would be a special year to dedicate that temple. Besides this kind of dedication and the service that you read, it's not something you're going to prepare on a weekend. It's going to take months and months. They've been planning for months to have this meeting, so you can imagine how long it would take to prepare the dedication of the temple and all of those details. The dedication would be held during the Feast of Tabernacles. That was one of the 3 annual feasts that all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem for every year. The Feast of Tabernacles was a week-long feast. This time they would extend it to 14 days. And you know that this temple replaces the tabernacle. That had been their place of worship in the wilderness. And the most obvious difference between the tabernacle and the temple is that the tabernacle was portable and the temple is permanent. And that temple was a confirmation of Israel's permanence in the land as promised by God. Now here are the priests and the Levites. They've assembled, and all the elders from the 12 tribes, and there are thousands of people that are in Jerusalem. They have watched for 7 years as this temple has been risen up from the ground and being built. And every year just builds to the anticipation and builds with the excitement. And I don't think it would be possible for us to capture the excitement of the moment that we're finally going to dedicate this temple. This temple was furnished much like the tabernacle. There were some differences. In that old tabernacle, there was 1 candlestick. In the temple, there were 10 candlesticks. In the old tabernacle, there was 1 table of showbread. In the temple, there would be 10 tables of showbread. In the old tabernacle, there was 1 brazen laver where the priest would wash, but in the temple, there would be 10 brazen lavers. And so every piece of furniture from the old tabernacle, it is duplicated into the temple, but it's made brand new. They didn't bring the old altar over, they made a new altar. They didn't bring the old candlestick over, they made a brand new candlestick. And so everything is brand new in the temple except for one thing. That is the Ark of the Covenant. Every piece of furniture is built new except for this ark. That original ark had been ordered by Moses. It's the only piece of furniture that's brought over. And it is the last item that is brought over into the temple. Everything is done, everything is said, except for that one piece. And so at the beginning of chapter 8, they bring that ark into the temple and they set it in its place. It's the crowning act. And now they can finally begin to worship in this house that is built for the Lord. The ark was a rectangular type of furniture. It was a box that was about 4 feet long and about 2.5 feet wide and about 2.5 feet high. It was made out of shittim wood, and if you've never been to Israel, you may have never even seen any shittim wood. But shittim wood was a tree it was the only tree that grew of any size in the desert. It was imperishable. It never decayed. It never rotted. And what was so unusual about the shittim wood tree is that at night, there was an ointment that oozed out of that tree, and it was only at night. And they said that ointment was very medicinal. They used it for a lot of different things. They made it out of shittim wood, and then that ark was completely covered inside and out with pure gold. And I don't have to preach this to you. You know that is a picture of Jesus Christ. The wood is his humanity. The gold is his deity. And when Moses had that ark built and placed it in the tabernacle, it represents the very presence of God in their midst. It sits in that inner sanctum called the most holy place, where only the high priest would go, and that only once a year on the Day of Atonement. It is where the high priest would sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat, and the Shekinah glory of God would fill the tabernacle. And then when Israel began the wilderness wanderings for 40 years, that ark always led the way. There was a family of Levites that they were dedicated and they were charged with just carrying that ark on their shoulders, and that ark was always out front. It led them through the wilderness. It led them across the Jordan River. It led them into the promised land. It led them into battle. But you know that there was a special way for that ark to be carried. I want you to hold your finger here. I want you to go back to Exodus chapter 25 very quickly with me. Let me show you this. And I know that you're familiar with it, but Exodus chapter 25, and look if you would in verse number 10. Exodus 25 and verse 10, they shall make an ark of shittim wood. 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, and a cubit and a half the breadth thereof, and a cubit and a half the height thereof. Thou shalt overlay it with pure gold. Within and without shalt thou overlay it. Thou shalt make upon it a crown of gold round about. Thou shalt cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in the 4 corners thereof. 2 rings should be on the one side of it, 2 rings on the other side of it. Watch this. Thou shalt make staves of shittim wood, and overlay them with gold. Thou shalt put the staves into the rings by the sides of the ark, that the ark may be borne with them. So Moses instructed the craftsmen to put 4 rings at each corner of the ark, and then you make 2 staves, or 2 poles, if you please, and you put them through those rings, and then men would pick up the 4 corners of those staves, and they would put that on their shoulder, and that's how that they would carry that ark. There was some parts of the tabernacle that you could carry with oxen and wagons and other pieces of furniture, but not this. There's a special way. It has to be carried by these staves, and men bore it upon their shoulders. And you know that it was death to carry it any other way. But notice, if you would, in chapter 25, look at verse number 15. Interesting little detail. The staves shall be in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. So evidently, even when they are not transporting it, those staves stayed with the ark. They just stayed in those 4 rings, and as far as I know, for hundreds of years, they were never taken out. That even when it's resting, those staves stay there. I don't know why, but come back to 1 Kings 8. Look at verse number 8. And they drew out the staves. That the ends of the staves were seen out in the holy place before the oracle. They were not seen without, and there they are unto this day. For the first time, in fact, the only time that I read in the Bible, those staves are taken out of those rings. Now, I don't mean to make more out of it than what it is, but it is what it is. And maybe Brother Gravely, it doesn't mean anything. But then again, maybe everything in the Bible means something. And Moses said that the staves are not to be taken out of it. And we never read that they were. Until the day that the ark reached its final resting place in that temple. And now the staves are taken out. And don't you know that in that whole service and that dedication, that there's 1,000 details that we're not told. But for some reason, we're told that. And there's been 100 sermons preached on the ark, and not a whole lot of attention given to the staves, and rightly so. But I wonder if there is a testimony in those 2 staves. And when I think about those 2 staves, I really see in them a picture of me. Let me explain. I believe that in those 2 staves there is a testimony of my conversion. Would you come back to chapter 25, Exodus 25? We'll go back and forth. Come back to Exodus 25. Look at verse number 13 again. And I want you to notice a word that is not in the text. Exodus 25, verse 13. Thou shalt make staves of shittim gold and overlay them with gold. Check it out, but did you know that every piece of furniture in the tabernacle that was covered with gold was covered with pure gold? But the staves are not covered with pure gold, it's just gold. The brazen altar, that's not covered with gold, that's covered with brass. But anything that is of gold is made of pure gold except those staves. That indicates to me that those staves are not a type of Christ, they're a picture of me. Pure gold was a picture of the deity of Jesus Christ. We're not pure gold. One day Moses takes these instructions from the Lord, and he gets a craftsman, he gets a workman, and he describes, here's what we need. We need 2 staves for a purpose. And so the first thing that the worker has to do is he has to go out into the forest, and he's looking for 2 trees. He's looking for 2 saplings that he can cut down and he can then make into these staves. He knows that he's looking for shittim wood. By the way, shittim wood was usually used just for burning. It was used for fire. Shittim wood was a tree that is destined for a fire. And so he goes out there and he's looking at these trees, and there's hundreds of trees, and he's not looking at just what they are, but he's looking at what he can make out of them one day. There's going to be a lot of work, and there's going to be a lot of preparation to get it ready and get it suitable to transport the ark. And so he looks beyond the branches and the brambles and the knots and the barks and all of that, and he has to see what he can make out of it. He goes into the forest and he looks past 100 saplings, and I don't know why he picked those 2 out, but he did pick those 2 out, and he's going to make them into a vessel for a suitable purpose. But the first thing he has to do is he had to cut them down. They're going to have to die. And so he takes those 2 trees and he cuts them down, and he drags them back to his tent, and he begins to strip them down. And he strips all of the bark, and he cuts all of the branches off, and he gets it down just to bare wood. Begins to sand it, he begins to whittle it, he begins to work on it, and he sands and he rubs his hand over to find a rough spot, and he sands that down, and he turns it over, and he's looking for another rough spot, and he sands that, and when he's got it completely stripped down, and it's sanded smooth, and it's perfectly round, and he dips it in molten gold. That rough sapling that you saw growing out there in the forest is now not covered with branches and bark and all of that, but now it's perfectly smooth and it's dipped in beautiful gold. In fact, when you look at it now, it doesn't look anything like it did when it was growing in that forest. You know, that's a picture of what Jesus Christ did for you and I. I was just one person in the sea of humanity that was destined for a fire. And there was nothing in me that made me stand out or get God's attention over anybody else. But one day, the Holy Spirit walked by my way and He chose me. I'm not a Calvinist, and I don't know why, but I do know that He chose me. It was not because of what He saw in me, but He saw what He can make out of me one day. He had a purpose for my life, and He said, I'm calling you. Do you know that when He called me, when He chose me, the Bible says that I am crucified with Christ. I had to die, but I wasn't ready for His service. I wasn't usable at that moment, so He had to begin to work in me to bring out what He saw. So He began to strip, and He began to cut, and He began to chip, and He began to sand. And the long process of knocking off the branches, and knocking off of the bark, and knocking off of the knots, and taking away everything that was not pleasing to Him. Even still, every once in a while, He runs His hand over me, finds a rough spot, does a little bit more sanding. He has dipped me in the gold of the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And I want you to know that if you could look at me now and saw what I used to be, you would say it's not the same person, and you'd be right, it's not the same person. I know that I'm just a piece of wood is all I am, but He's dipped me in the righteousness of Christ. He saw something that I couldn't see. He saw what He could make out of me. He had a purpose for my life, but there's going to be a lot of cutting and a lot of sanding and a lot of chipping and a lot of cleaning up to make me a worthy vessel. And I just want to say this morning that I'm glad for every step of the way that has brought me from the forest of humanity to one of His chosen vessels. I'm thankful for the day that He walked by my way and He chose me, and I'm thankful for the long process of stripping me of selfishness and self-confidence and pride, and I'm thankful for the molding and the making and the shaping. I'm thankful that He chose me. I see this as a picture of my conversion. But I look at these 2 staves, not only is it a picture of my conversion, it is a picture of my commission. Would you look at verse number 14? Verse number 14. Thou shalt put the staves into the rings by the sides of the ark, that the ark may be borne with them. Now, I've already said that the ark had to be carried by these 2 staves. Men are not allowed to touch it. They're not allowed to put it on a wagon. These staves are what to be used. They're placed through the rings, and 4 men get on 4 corners, and they pick it up and they put it on their shoulders. So when that craftsman went out there to look for 2 small trees that he could shape into these staves, he has a purpose in mind. They are not decorative pieces. They're not walking sticks. They are to be used for one thing. That craftsman has one purpose in mind: to make them into staves to carry the ark of God. Do you know what was in the ark, by the way? Hebrews 9 says that there was a golden pot of manna, that there was a rod that budded, and the tablets of stone that had the 10 commandments. Now again, if you read the Bible correctors, they would tell you that it wasn't inside the ark, that it was outside the ark, and they're wrong again. Those 3 things were carried inside that ark. However, I would tell you that those 3 things were not always carried inside that ark. Come back to 1 Kings 8. Come back. We're flipping back and forth. Come back to 1 Kings chapter 8 and look at verse number 9. There was nothing in the ark save the 2 tables of stone, which Moses put there at Horeb. By the time that ark finishes its journey and gets to the temple, the only thing in there are the tables of stone. Somewhere along the way, that golden pot of manna and that Aaron's rod that budded, somewhere along the way, maybe when the Philistines had it, I don't know, but somewhere along the way that has been removed, perhaps been lost. But the only thing that's been carried in that ark that we know for sure for the entire voyage is the 10 tables of stone. Do you know what was written on those 10 tables of stone? It's the 10 commandments. That 10 commandments is a message of holiness, and it's a message of condemnation. Those stones tell the world this is what God demands, and it also tells you how you fall short. The message on those stones is that you are a sinner and you're under the condemnation of a holy and a righteous God. By the way, we've gotten away from preaching the law because it's so offensive. But how can you preach the gospel without first telling men about the law? How can you tell a man how to be saved if he's not even convinced that he's lost first? And you may not like that part of the message, but everywhere those staves carried that ark, they carried the message to the world that you stand guilty before God. The reason why we need these 2 staves, the purpose why we're going through this process is because we need to carry that news everywhere, that God is holy, that God has a law, and you have transgressed it. That's your commission. But that's not the only thing, because on top of that ark was a mercy seat. There was a lid that had 2 cherubims over it. And that mercy seat was made it wasn't made out of shittim wood and gold. It's made out of pure gold. And the law inside of the ark says that God condemns you, but the mercy seat on top of the ark says that there is mercy. That mercy seat is where the blood would be sprinkled, and God was satisfied with that sacrifice. And we must not stop from telling the world that you're guilty before God and you're under condemnation. But then raise your voice just a little bit more and say that there's mercy at the cross for you. 2 staves. You wouldn't think much of them. They're just growing in the woods. Well, look at them. They're smooth and they're clean and they're perfectly rounded and they're dipped in gold. And the master craftsman said, I have made you for a purpose. I have a job for you. Everything that I am doing to you, I am doing for a purpose. I want you to carry this ark, and I want you to carry these tablets of stone. I want you to carry this message everywhere you go. And you cannot find one place in the Bible where that ark ever went without those staves, or where the staves ever went without the ark. They never took a day off. That is their commission. They weren't created for anything else except that we don't use it to prop up an extra leg on the table of showbread. We're not going to use it to stir the embers of the altar. No, if you don't do this, there is no use for you. I'm afraid that a lot of Christians are not interested in obeying that commission. And churches have become social clubs to make Christians feel good about not doing what God has told them to do. But I want to tell you that if you won't perform what God has commissioned you to do, God will set you in the corner and say, I'll find somebody else. Think about this quickly. I hurry. It took 4 men and 2 staves to carry that ark. You couldn't carry that ark with just one stave. It took both. It took some cooperation. If one man called in sick, if one man decided I'm going to take a day off, long weekend, whatever, then that's a much greater burden on the other 3. It takes all 4. It takes some cooperation. And I would just say that in the church, you need me and I need you. And the missionary, I need the missionary to go across the seas or go into the prisons or wherever it might be with our message, but you need me to stay behind and support you. And we need the pastor to shepherd the church, but he needs the people to support and pray for him. You can't carry the ark with just one stave. It takes 2. In fact, come back to Exodus 25. Come back to it. There's an interesting word here, Exodus 25. Look, if you would, in verse number 21. Exodus 25 and verse number 21. And I'll find it here in a minute. Exodus chapter 25, verse 21. He says, thou shalt put the mercy seat above upon the ark, and in the ark shalt put the testimony that I shall give thee. The ark is sometimes called the ark of testimony because it carried a testimony everywhere that it went. That's the job, is to carry this testimony everywhere you go. And nobody ever praised the staves. Nobody ever said, boy, those are 2 really good-looking staves. Nobody ever said, I'd really like to have 2 staves like that. They never drew any attention to themselves. There never was any admiration. You just do your job, and all of the attention is on the ark and the testimony. Your job and mine is not to draw attention to ourselves or to garner the praise of men. No, it's just carry the testimony of Christ everywhere that we go. And in any ministry that God allows me to have, may all of the glory and the praise and the attention go to Him. May I never sing a song for the praise of men. And may I never preach a sermon for the applause of men. And I pray that I never teach a class to be seen of men. But may my life be a testimony of the grace of Jesus Christ. And may my life be spent in carrying that message to the world. Can I use a bit of sanctified imagination here? I'm hurrying, I really am. 2 staves. As long as those 2 staves remained in the forest, they would have grown until the fire would have eventually taken them. Maybe a forest fire may be cut down to use as firewood. But just think of where those 2 staves got to go and what they got to see when that master craftsman came and said, I have a job for you. It was 486 years from the building of the tabernacle to the building of the temple. And for 486 years, everywhere that ark went, those 2 staves went to. Did you know when they crossed the Jordan River that the ark led the way? And there was the staves. Did you know that when they came into Canaan and they marched around Jericho and marched around Jericho and marched around Jericho, do you know what led the way? Them 2 staves carrying that ark. When the Philistines stole it, put it in the temple of Dagon, and Dagon fell, those staves are there. They got to see that. And people think that if I surrender my life to Christ, it's going to be boring and it's going to be, listen, I'll never hear you. Hey, I'm going to tell you something. It's not boring serving Jesus. Serving Jesus will take you places. It'll let you see things that you'd have never gotten to see. It'll give you opportunities that you never thought existed. You didn't know what kind of a life that it would be when God called you unto Himself, but it's been a great life. I'm telling you, that night that I surrendered to the call to preach as an 8-year-old boy, I never thought I'd be standing in this place preaching. I want to tell you, it's a wonderful thing to serve Him. Every war that Israel fought, that ark is in the front with those 2 staves carrying it. By the way, in every one of those battles, there was never any harm to those 2 staves. It carried the testimony even to dangerous places, but they were never any safer than when they were closer to that ark. That ark is a picture of Jesus Christ that carried Christ to the world. That ark is where the glory of God would come down. Those staves got to see what nobody else got to see. They led that ark into some of the greatest events in Israel's history. Those staves had a front row seat. The testimony of my commission. I come back to 1 Kings chapter 8. I'm done. It's a picture of my conversion. It's a picture of my commission. But look again at 1 Kings 8 and verse 8. It's a picture of my crowning. They drew out the staves. Then the ends of the staves were seen out in the holy place before the oracle. They were not seen without. And there they are to this day. For 486 years, those two staves have faithfully carried that ark and that testimony everywhere they went. They've carried it across rivers, and they've carried it through deserts. And they've carried it into battles. And they have faithfully fulfilled the task they were called to. And they did nothing else. But now Solomon has built the temple. The last piece of furniture to be brought in is this ark. That ark has moved around, but now it's coming into its final resting place. And the ark would no longer be carried to men, but you'll have to come to Jerusalem now to see the ark. Here comes the long procession. Levites, priests, elders marching toward the temple. And there's music, and there's singing, and there is shouting, and it's such great jubilation. And leading that procession are 4 men. And each man has a corner of a stave on his shoulder. And they're carrying that ark. And they carry that ark into the temple. And they very carefully set it down in a special place. And this is where it is going to sit. And it's a passing detail. But in all of the buzz of what's going on, you have a verse that tells you what happened to the staves. For the first time, they pulled the staves out. They laid them down by the side. And if we're reading the verse right, you can see them protruding out into the holy place, but not out into the court. And there they are unto this day. You've carried the ark faithfully, but now your mission is complete. No more deserts, and no more rivers, and no more battles, but now it's time to rest. Rest here beside the ark and bask in the worship that men are going to come and lavish upon God. They're not worshiping you, but you get to be there to witness the worship. You've completed the task. You've accomplished your purpose. You did what I called you for. Just rest. The king decided that these 2 staves have been so faithful and so instrumental that they ought to have a special place in the house of God. By the way, there's no law that says you have to do this. There's no scripture that says Solomon has to do this. But we're not going to just ignore. We're not just going to forget 486 years of carrying the ark. No. This is your reward. Just 2 trees growing in the forest, cut down, stripped, sanded, dead. Stripped of everything that is unseemly and unusual and dipped in gold. Given a commission. Faithfully carried the testimony for 486 years through dangers and toils and snares. And now they rest in the house of God as nations come to worship. And I can't help but think that one day not Solomon but Christ will come to a temple built just for him. And he's going to sit on a throne, and nations are going to come and worship him. And there will be people gathered around that throne that you carried the testimony to. But in that day, our work will be complete. We will have finished the task that we were called to do. And the king, he's not going to just ignore. He's not just going to forget all the years and all the labor and all the toiling. It'll be time to rest near the throne. And I know that the laborer gets weary. And I know the worker gets tired. And I know that sometimes you don't see the results. And you wonder if there's any fruit. And I know that sometimes the critic is louder than the compliments. You have to fight the urge to want to get bitter and to strike back. I know. And I know that Sunday's a great day, but then Monday comes. I know that one day you're on the mountain and the next day in the valley. And I know that sometimes you just want to throw in the towel. Say, I'm done. But just pick up the ark. Just keep carrying the testimony. Be faithful to the calling. I promise you that your service is not unnoticed. I promise you that your labor will not be unrewarded. That the day of rest is ahead. That it will be worth every trial that you've had to bear just to hear you say, faithful servant. And for 1,000 years, to be gathered around that throne and watch his nations come and worship not me, but the King, to worship him. And to know that I had a part in that. And one of these days we will rest. Our Heavenly Father, sitting in this room tonight are men who have given their life to go into the darkest places in this nation and around the world to carry that testimony. And sitting in this room today are ladies who have said, I'll follow you. And they've quit their jobs, and they've left behind careers, and they've sold their homes. And they have to go to churches and beg for support and try to make ends meet. But would you let them know this morning that your labor is not unnoticed? It is not unrewarded. Just pick the testimony up. Carry it into another prison. Take it to another person. That one of these days, you're coming. And then, it'll be time to rest. Encourage our hearts, I pray. In Jesus' name.